Welcome to the first video in the series on oil painting. This is my Oils for Beginners. Welcome to my studio. I'm Melanie Cambridge, and I'm here to introduce you to the fabulous world of oil painting and guide you through, starting with a look at the materials and equipment that you're going to need for this course. And then we're going to progress and look at making marks, mixing colours, before we start creating our first still life paintings. So by the end of the video, you will have produced several short studies and hopefully a couple of still life paintings that you can be really proud of. So let's make a start, and I need to introduce you first of all to oil paints and the materials. Oil paints in general come in various size tubes and all sorts of different brands. I mean, one quite familiar one is Daler Rowney. There's an Italian make, Classico, a Dutch paint called Van Gogh. So there are lots of different paints. But the key thing to understand is that there are artist quality colours and what are called student quality colours. Now, the difference between these is really partly in the price, partly in some of the pigments that are used, because some pigments, such as cobalt blue and some of the cadmiums, are quite expensive. So they'll go into the artist range, but in a beginner's range, you might have a colour that's called a hue, H-U-E. So you might, instead of having cadmium red, you could have cadmium red hue. And all this means that it's made of a synthetic alternative. So that there's nothing wrong with the colour, it's beautiful paint, it's fine for you to use, but it's not quite exactly, it's not exactly the same as pure cadmium red. When you're first starting out, it really makes no difference. You just want to get confident mixing your colours and understanding what's, how they work together, rather than worrying whether you've got a hue colour or a pure pigment. So now I'm going to just show you a little bit of a talk through the materials here, and then we'll move on to exactly what you're going to need for this course. Obviously, I've got lots of tubes of brushes. We then come on to, I'll just move that out of the way, and then you can have a look at my palette. The palette here, this is my complete wooden palette. And as you can see, there's a lot of paint on there. I don't clean it very often, and I lay all the colours out. And we'll come to this when we start painting. I lay all the colours out in the same order so that I know where all my colours are. It almost becomes instinctive to pick up different colours. And this is something that's going to be very important when you start learning to paint. We're not going to go through everything there. I just wanted you to have a look at them and also to introduce you to the sorts of brushes you would use with oils. I've picked up some new brushes to start with. So we've got a range. Some are sort of white, springy filbert brushes, a flat brush and a round brush. So let's just take a closer look at brushes before we start. Now, when you're thinning your colours with oil paint, it comes in a tube. You have various options for cleaning the paint. Some paints water mixable paints, and the water mixable paints you need to be thinning them with water or with a specialist water mixable medium. That's a slightly different thing, which I will cover towards the end of the video. I'm using a low odor thinners or white spirit. So I've got two sort of what you would call watery products. These are to thin the colours and also to clean your brushes with. You can use the paint straight from the tube, or you could choose to use something like an alkyd medium, which is like a blend of oil and spirit, linseed oil and turpentine, and usually a quick drying alkyd gel. Makes a sort of double cream consistency product that you can use to thin the colours. So we're going to start by looking at laying out the colours on your palette and how you can thin them and the different consistencies. And then I want to introduce you to the brushes and the different sorts of marks that you can make with the brushes. I'm not going to be painting pictures immediately. I want you to understand how the paint works and the various marks you can make to get started. Before we start actual painting, we need to decide what surfaces we're going to paint on. This is a very basic canvas pad I bought actually from the works, and it's like a watercolour pad, but the paper itself is coated, so that this side is rather like a canvas surface, and the other side, you can feel it's like the back of a fact you would only paint
on this primed and sized surface with the oil paint. And a canvas pad is an absolutely ideal place to start as a beginner, because you get a pad finish that different manufacturers make. I mean, this, as I say, this one's Crawford and Black, but you work on this as a fairly cheap surface to paint on and have lots of time to do lots of practicing before you sort of move on to other surfaces. So that's the main surface I'm going to use for this video, the canvas pad. However, there are other options. One of these things is called a canvas board. This one is Daler Rowney, and you can see it comes in lots of different sizes. It's basically a stiff sort of cardboard onto which has been glued, in effect, a sheet of the oil sketching paper, so that you've got a canvas surface, but it's on a rigid board. You could frame this, you could take it outside to paint, the light wouldn't shine through it. It's quite robust. And it's another good surface for painting on as a beginner. One thing I quite like to paint on, and again, is another fairly cheap sort of surface you can get together. This looks more like a painting surface. This is a sheet of pre-cut MDF, medium density fiberboard, which you can get from a hardware shop, or certain art suppliers will supply them because they're generally used as a backing sheet for a watercolor in a frame. But I have these, I give them 2 coats of a white primer, the primer being this sort of, it's called white acrylic gesso. But then I've coated it, I've mixed a colour, I've added a little bit of acrylic into my pattern and made a coloured gesso. I will show you how to do this later on when we come to do our more finished paintings. But it gives another surface, a smooth surface. This one is coloured, that you can paint on directly on with your oil paints. And then, of course, we come to a primed canvas. And a lot of primed canvases these days, you can get them in your local art shops or online, and they come ready stretched onto a frame and ready primed. So that has got a coat of this gesso acrylic primer on it, and it's ready to go. You could just paint on it straight away, or you might put a coloured wash on it. You could do other things, but it's basically it's much lighter, quite nice and portable, and it's easy. Unless you choose to paint down the edge, which I personally don't, I tend to put some masking tape on the edge to protect it, keep it white. Then it's easy to pick up when it's wet, because there's no wet edge. You've got this still dry edge to pick up and carry around with you. So that's a primed canvas instead. But we're going to make a start today on the painting board, on the paper. So that's what I'll just clip that to my board before we start. But we're going to need a palette to put the paints out on. Now, you can have a traditional wooden palette, as I showed you earlier, which is my palette, which is my working palette in the studio. Or a lot of manufacturers make what's called a paper palette, a tear-off palette. Reasonable size. Again, it comes in little pad, and basically, you can see this one's quite well used. It's sheets of very thin, but coated like a plastic coating, slippery surface, as a palette. And I'm going to lay the colours out on here, and then when we've finished painting for the day, or even if you've just got in a bit of a mess, you can transfer the colours onto a new sheet. You just gently peel this away, transfer any big blobs onto the next sheet, and throw that away. It's very quick and clean, and no need for lots of wiping up or tidying up. So a paper tear-off palette, which you'll get, lots of different manufacturers make them, then that's a good thing to have when you're starting out, because you just lay a few colours out, do your lesson, or have a paint for a couple of hours, and then that paint, you just throw that dirty palette away. You don't have to clean it up. Right, so let's make a start on laying some colours out on this palette, and let's start by getting to know our oil paints. So if I clip that there to start with, this is vertical, but you can see that what I'm going to do now is lay out the colours that we're going to use. Now, oil paint is quite buttery and soft. If I squirt this on here, the lovely bright red, that is a cadmium red, or we could have a cadmium red. I'm going to start with a very primary colours. We're not going to need a lot of colours, but look how juicy that is when we squish it out. So we've got a cadmium red and a lemon yellow. And then for this video, we're going to work with a cobalt blue or a cobalt blue hue. So we've got a medium blue. So we've got a red, yellow and blue. Then I have what's called, actually its fancy name is dioxine violet. It sounds rather a lot. We can just call it violet. The reason it's dioxine violet, that's the name of the pigment that it's made of. So I've got a violet. And for this purpose, we're going to have a little bit of viridian green, which is not a very natural green. It's quite a sort of false green, really, but it's going to teach us a lot about painting greens. And then finally, for colours, I've got a brown. Now this brown is quite a terracotta brown. It's called burnt sienna. So I've got red, yellow, blue, violet, green, brown, burnt sienna. And then separately on my palette, a little bit down here away from the other colours, we're going to mix colours into it. I'm going to put some titanium white. So those are the colours that you're going to need for your painting. Let's just take if I just zoom this in, we can have a closer look. So there, we just come a little bit closer in and you can see the colours. So we've got cadmium red, lemon yellow, cobalt blue, violet, viridian and burnt sienna. And as you can see that there's a little bit of oil coming out of the tubes already and they're running down the palette. So they're a lovely buttery texture. And that's one of the things I really enjoy painting with oil paints. So now we've got all our colours on the palette. I'm just going to introduce you to the 3 brushes that I'm going to use for this course. I've got, with oils, you would tend to use either a flat or a filbert brush, traditionally made with hog hair. These are actually synthetic versions from my own range, and I prefer them. They're a little bit, they hold a sharp edge a lot better than the traditional hog hair. But this is these 2 are both filbert brushes. This is a standard filbert, it's a number 8, and it's really good for blocking in big areas of colours. Then I've got the extra long filbert, which acts got a lot more flex on it and is a lovely brush for painting with oils. And then I have a different coloured hair. This brown brush is softer and gives us a nice round brush for details and a point. So we've got 3 brushes that I'm going to use. Now, on top of that, I have 2 knives. This knife is you'd say, well, they're both palette knives. Well, yes, this one is a palette knife. The palette knife is flat. There's no kink in the blade, and it is really predominantly used for mixing colours on your palette or even on your paper, but on the palette and scraping colour off. It's got a long blade, it's fairly flexible, and that is a palette knife. This is a painting knife, and you can see you've got a kink in the handle. And it can be used for mixing colours in the same way. I quite like one with a rounded end. Other brushes come with more like a trowel shape with a pointed end. Entirely up to you what you use. And this is for painting. And the reason it's a painting knife is I can fit my hand in between the handle without my knuckles getting stuck and getting onto the wet painting surface. So that's what makes it a painting knife as opposed to a palette knife. But everybody calls everything a palette knife. It doesn't really matter. So now we're going to make a start on getting to know oil paint. Before you start to think of anything else, take one of the brushes. I'm taking the number 4 filbert and make a start. Dip the brush without any thinners or not dip it into anything else. Just dip the brush straight into the paint and apply some paint onto the canvas. And you'll see it's very buttery. And it's quite easy for the marks of the brush strokes to be shown. The thicker you put the paint on, you can almost put little big lumps on it. And it's not blended. You will find marks appearing on your brush stroke. I put out a little bit of the low odor thinners into a pot. So I'm just dipping my brush into that. So my brush has got a little bit of thinner on it now. And in fact, I don't even need to put it on here. Let's just add it straight onto the paint. And as soon as you start to put some thinner onto your paint, it thins it out considerably, it goes much smoother, you can blend it a lot easier, and you get a flatter surface. If you put too much thinner out, you will find that it goes very watery. You see, it almost looks water. I mean, it's not watery because it's oil, but it sort of thins it right down, and becomes what you would call almost a wash, or we call it a Terpsy wash. So you've got different textures. I'm going to having cleaned my brush, I'm going to go into the next colour and paint into that. And now you'll start to see more texture appearing as I'm adding some yellow. And of course, red and yellow will make orange. So the more you press into the other colour with a yellow brush, we don't get yellow, we get an orange blending, mixing on the canvas. And we get lots of different marks and lines, and it becomes quite an exciting little surface as you're working. And this is one of the, I think, the really beautiful, exciting parts about oil paint, is the fact that you can make so many different sorts of marks, thick paint, thin paint. Let's move along the palette and add a little bit of the blue into here. Let's put some flat blue and then turn the brush on its edge and sort of put in some little sort of squiggles and circles and anything else that you want to do. And you see, as the paint gets thinner, you see how that's going sort of like a dry, it's called a dry brush effect. We've not really got enough paint on, and it's just picking up the little sort of rough edges of the surface of this canvas paper. It gives a very nice effect, and you can see how many different marks you can start to make with these colours. So for the very first exercise, that's what I want you to do. Get to know your paint. Don't worry about what colours you make, what you're mixing. Put it on thickly. Put it on and spread the paint with your brush until it goes dry brush. And then here, let's just take a little bit of green. We could add some little dots, make some different types of marks. I'm going to talk a little bit more in a moment about brush strokes. But when you first pick up oil paint, have a play and get to know the paint and what it feels like. If it's not feeling at all buttery, you're probably either don't just use it with thinner, use the paint neat out of the tube as well to get that textural effect, and have a bit of fun. So did you manage to make lots of different marks and mix the colours together and just have a fun? You may even have created sort of an abstract painting out of it. Now it's time to move on and look at each brush in turn and the sorts of different marks that we can make with these brushes, so that then we'll be ready to create our first painting. The first one we're going to start with the biggest. This is a number 8 filbert brush. It's a filbert as opposed to flat because it's got a little slight curve. I don't know if you can see that just around the edge there. It's rather than being cut straight across. So you can use it in lots of different ways. I'm just going to load my brush to start with some paint. Let's take some of the violet for a change, and say, well, if you paint that straight down, you will get quite a lot. You see the width of the brush stroke there. It's quite a wide brush. Great for mixing in and using it on the flat, holding the brush like you would a pen, but a little bit further back down your hand. Don't be tempted to scrunch it right up and hold it too tight. Hold it a bit further back, and then you've got plenty of room to paint really almost from your shoulder rather than and certainly from the arm. I don't want you just flicking it with the wrist. Try and paint, big marks. You could do a very long line across that. Need a little bit more paint on the brush. Get a little bit more paint, a bit of thinner on the brush, and you can make a big mark. And you could soon block in a whole sky or a big area of colour with this brush. But this brush has quite a sharp edge to it. So whilst it's still loaded with brush, providing I'm careful, and if you use fairly light pressure through your hand, look at that. You can actually make some quite fine lines with this thick brush. It needs to have paint on it. You can't just leave it. And in fact, the other thing to think about is to vary the pressure. If I press on and lift off, especially if I turn the brush on its edge, press on and lift off and press on again, and you start to get a sort of a glob. Do you see how that's becoming a different mark? Just by the way I'm maneuvering the brush, all holding it with what I would call a traditional hold of the brush. There are other ways to hold the brush, and we'll have a look at those in a moment. But that's the number 8, so it's quite a large, about almost an inch wide, or 25 centimeters, 25 millimeters wide, with its slightly rounded edge. And I use this brush a lot in the early stages of painting to do big marks and bold out and to cover a lot of paint, a lot of areas of the canvas with paint. So have a go with each brush in turn and just see what it does and what sort of marks you can make. I'm going to cover on the same page this second brush, and you can see how much smaller it is. This is a number 8, this is a number 4. So it's half the size, but it's extra long. It's a long filbert. So it has a bit more spring. It almost behaves in a slightly different way. So let's take a different colour. Let's get some yellow. And again, you can have the brush and it will cover fairly large area because it's still a filbert brush. So I can still get sort of that area of colouring in a big section fairly quickly. And being a filbert brush, of course, I can turn it on its edge and do the same thing with some fine lines or some swirls or lift and press and lift and press. If you really wanted to get a different colour because it'll show up a bit better, we could do some little flicks. So that's taking the end of the brush. You see, I've been very lazy. I haven't cleaned the brush. I've just dipped it into the green. It doesn't matter. And then I'm flicking that brush to make some different marks. So one brush can be very versatile. You can also do a few little, if we just come down here, I do some single marks. Now there's a difference between just stippling and doing that, which will, that was just pushing the end onto the canvas. It will damage the surface, it will damage the brush. You will work away on you'll lose that sharp edge of the brush. But if you want little marks, do little tiny strokes. You see how I'm just pressing on the canvas a little bit and then lifting off. And I could do lots of little dots. Now those could turn into leaf shapes in turn, or little spotty marks, whatever you want them to be. So again, I want you to take your time and have a practice of what you can do with each brush. Those are the two filberts. Let's just move on and take a look at a round brush. Now, the round brush I recommend for this course is a number 4 round. It's quite a fine brush. So you say, oh, well, it's only for detail. And it is really mainly for details. So I'm dipping it into the cobalt blue. A little bit of adding a tiny bit of the thinners from my pot just to get it to flow. So I've got a brush that's loaded with paint. I'm holding it, again, instinctively holding it quite a long way back, because what you don't want to do is to try and make a mark like that. And then your hand, and then you run out of space and your wrist is in the way and you want to do something that's really straight. And actually what happens is it turns into a slightly wiggly line because you've got too much tension in your hand and you're holding the brush too close. On the other hand, if I take my hand like this and I go for a straight line, but if you move the brush quicker, you will need to add a little bit of thinners to your paint to make it flow, but you can have a lot more control over what you're doing with your brush, because can you see, as I'm using the brush, I'm moving my hand down the canvas as well, and not just holding my hand still and trying to fit it in. And that is more difficult. Try and do that without, I can't really do it, but trying to do that without moving just keeping my wrist locked and doing it all from here. Don't do that. Use your hand, and then you can have lovely marks. And also it works the other way. So I can come up and be very fluid with some marks. So for instance, here, I know this is blue, but if I wanted to paint a tree, let's just get some brown on the brush and dip into the burnt sienna. Wanted to paint a tree shape, we could go with starting at the bottom. You see how if you press heavier, you get a thicker line, and then lift and lift and lift, and it will flick. Lift and flick, and look. There we are. Look at that. Easy, isn't it? It should be easy. Bit of grass on the bottom. There. Look how I've done that. Just by pressing and lifting and having the brush relatively loaded with paint. What you find will happen with your brush, and it's happening here now, is I've used up the paint from the tip, and the residual paint is moving down the bristles, down the brush, and it's becoming a big lump further down. In fact, it's there. Can you see there's virtually no paint on the front, but there's paint in the middle. That's because of the pressure through your hand. The more pressure you put through your hand, the more the paint sort of creeps up the brush until at the end you think, well, I've got loads of paint on this brush and I'm not getting any marks. That's because you haven't got any paint on the tip. So do try when you're painting never to be too heavy-handed. You can be bold with the paint, but if you're too heavy-handed with it, it will just slip off the brush, go up the frill, and you'll have a big lump of paint sitting here and none on the tip. So just a thought when you're handling your brushes. So let's take a look at the colours we have and how to mix colours. I started off by painting a very simple colour wheel. We're starting at the red. We've got red, violet, blue, green, yellow and orange. Now on the colour wheel there are primary colours and secondary colours as I first pointed. So the primary colours, as most people would know, are red, yellow and blue. And in between them the mixes, so if you mix red and yellow together you will get an orange, and similarly red and blue will make a violet and yellow and blue will make a green. So orange, violet and green are what are known as secondary colours, can be mixed from the three primaries. So that's the first thing that we're going to learn on today's lesson, is we're going to start mixing some colours. I'm going to start with a colour green. That is the green that we've got in our tube, that's Viridian green. If I take some of the cobalt blue, a bit of the blue, and take a fairly large chunk of the yellow. Now, don't mix them when you're mixing colours, even on your palette, and I'm doing it on the painting here rather than on the palette to show you. Take the colours side by side to start with, even on your palette, and just drag them across. And you'll see that if you add a little bit of the blue, you get a very bright sort of green, and if you add a lot more of the blue, you will get a darker green. And you can mix that around. In fact, we could even add a little bit more blue, so that when you're mixing your colours, you're mixing a range of colours. If you just keep putting one blob in the middle, yes, you'll get a colour, but it might be a bit too green, it might be a bit too dark, you might want it a bit lighter. Whereas by doing this method, you get to control how much of the colour you add in at any one time. So that's the yellow. We take the yellow and blue. Let's take the yellow again down here. Again, this time I'm going to put a big blob of yellow, because also knowing that the yellow is quite a soft colour. It's not as strong as the red. So if you now take a tiny little bit of the red, put it alongside it, the red is very powerful. And you will find that it will very quickly overpower. You'll just get a version of red. It very quickly overpowers the yellow. You do get an orange, but see how much yellow you really need to make a yellowy orange as opposed to a reddy orange. There's my yellowy orange. There's my sort of more or less pure orange, and it very quickly goes to red. So you can have a go at mixing these colours for yourself. I'm mixing them here with a brush because I'm doing it on the palette. You can mix it with your palette knife on your palette, but it's quite useful to have some painted blobs. So now we want to come to the violet. Now we've got a tube of violet, and this is going to mix slightly differently. We'll take the blue that we've got, which is the cobalt blue, which is a nice mid blue. It's sort of slightly warm, slightly and then we'll take a little bit of the red alongside it. I haven't cleaned my brush very well there. Take that red and drag it across, and I'm keeping, all the time I'm painting, I keep rinsing the brush and also wiping the excess paint off the brush, so that then I can drag it across. Now it's not going to make quite the same violet as we've got in our tube because of the influence of the red. There's a lot. The red has a very strong influence. It doesn't make quite such a violet, but it is making a sort of a purple. That's looking a little bit dark in this light, because the next thing to think about with your colours is, well, how do I make a lighter colour? All very well mixing these strong colours, but how do I make it lighter? With oils, there's no point in keep thinning the colours with the white spirit or the odourless thinners or whatever you're going to use. You've got to add white paint to make a lighter colour. There is no way it's going to work unless you do that. So if I put some white onto the edge of this and mix it into this mauve, It's almost a grey colour there, a bit more blue in the mix, but you can see that that's making a very, very pale version. Similarly, clean the brush, reload it with a bit more white. We'll go into this reddy orange, not too much white, and you start to see we'll get a much paler, almost a sunset colour. It's actually a lovely colour, that. Look at that. A little bit more red back into it. You see how you're mixing lighter versions, much paler, giving you a real range of colours. So white is a good colour in general to get a lighter pigment. Let's just put a bit of white into this green and see if we can get more of a minty green going, and a yellowy green by adding a bit of white into there. Yeah, you've got that. Just take that across, and that gives a very different sort of colour. So that's what I want you to practice next, is to take each of the colours, paint yourself a little colour wheel. All of the colours you already have on your palette apart from the orange, so you're going to have to mix that with a little bit of red and mainly yellow. Paint yourself a very simple colour wheel and then have a go at mixing each of the colours. So mix the prime, the red and the blue, the red and the yellow and the yellow and the blue. So mix those colours together so that you will get, when you mix these colours, you get the orange. You mix these two, you get a version of violet. And then you mix the blue and the yellow and you get a version of green. So now you've understanding about mixing the primary colours together to get the secondary colours. The other thing that is very useful with painting is to learn how to make a slightly dull or slightly softened colour. Sometimes you don't want a really bright red or a bright green. You want one that's a little bit more towards neutral. Especially when we come to paint flowers and fruit, we don't want the colours to be too bright in cases. So if we're going to take a colour, what we need to understand is that the colours opposite each other on the wheel. So if I just take a little bit of brown here, which we haven't used. So red and green and yellow and violet and orange and blue. Those are called complementary colours. Now the complementary colour, if you mix the complementary colours together, they will sort of knock each other out, they neutralise each other. So if we want to make a colour that's not a bright version, so if I take, for instance, down here, I'm going to take the violet, which is the purple, which we've got in the tube, and in fact I'm going to put a tiny little bit of white in so you can see it a little bit better on the screen. So we've got a nice violet colour. But I don't want it, I'm going to paint some hills with that, and I don't want the painting to be bright violet or even the flower. I want a softer colour. Now, complementary to that is yellow, but you're not talking about adding a huge amount of yellow. Proportionately, only a very little bit. So we'll take a little bit of the yellow, and then we'll just take a bit of this yellow and just mix it in to this area here. And pull it together, and I don't know if you can see, but that starts to go, it almost looks a little bit brown. It knocks all of the mauve colour and turns it to a very neutral sort of colour, where the yellow has affected the mauve. That's what it does. It sort of neutralises it out, makes it quite grey. You say, well, I can't really see that. We can't really see it very well, so let's just put a bit of white. We put white into the purple, it's pale purple. But if I put white into this area where I've mixed it with the yellow, we get, when they're next to each other, can you see how that is this is a bright purple and this is a greyed down, it's sort of like it's almost like a soft sort of purpley grey. That's what complementary colours do. We try it again with the red and the green. Let's take the bright red. Now we've got some ready mixed green on our palette, haven't we? Because we have Viridian, so let's just use it. Take a bit of the green. So if I wanted to make a dark red, a darker red, tiny bit of the green into the red, only a tiny bit, don't need much. Put too much in, it just knock itself completely. Can you see how that red is just taking a little bit of that? It's making a dull red now, isn't it? Look at that. See how it's affected the red. The bright red has gone much duller, slightly browner, but much duller. That's what the complementary green has done to the red. If we had a really bright green, it would work the other way. It would make the bright green darker and duller. And then finally, if I take the blue, now the blue is tricky because it should be blue and orange. So if I take the blue, now we mixed an orange and it was a very yellowy orange. And the problem with a very yellow orange is that it tends to behave like yellow. So if I put a colour into this that's more like that bright orange, it's going to go green. Because paint doesn't behave quite perfectly for colour theory, because colour theory, sadly, is based on light, not on pigment. So that's got a bias towards yellow, and if we put that in there, it's just going to go green. This is one of the other reasons why I've got the brown on my palette. Now, my brown is burnt sienna. Now, burnt sienna to me is a very dark sort of orangey brown. So that orange acts to me like a very dark orange. And if I put a bit of that colour into my blue, and you might not see this very well until we add a bit of white, but if I mix the blue and the burnt sienna together, and then I'll put a little bit of white in the bottom so you can see that's gone brown, and that goes, we need a bit more blue in the mix. That goes blue. And in there, you can start to see that that goes to more of a grey shade. The bluey grey, it goes to more of a bluey grey shade. If we'd gone with the orange, the pure mixed orange, it would not work. You can try it, have a go. So now we've covered on this whole lesson on mixing colours, how to mix the secondary colours. So we've taken the red and yellow has made the orange, the red and blue has made the mauve, and then the blue and yellow has made a green. And then we've looked at complementary colours. So adding a tiny bit of a colours complementary to create a sort of neutralised, either a slightly darker version of it or a neutralised colour we can then make a grey by adding white. I know that's quite a lot to take in, but this area of understanding colours, and this is a basic introduction to colours, works with any kind of paint. So if you decide oils are not for me, I'm going to go for watercolour or I'm going to go for acrylics. This is not wasted time because this is colour theory, and this works across all the paints that you might choose to mix with. Take your time and have a little go at this lesson, because the next thing we need to do is to move on to starting to actually paint some objects. And we're going to need all this knowledge on mixing colours and handling the brushes if we're going to be successful in the next stage. So here is our first art project. We're going to have a go at painting a banana. Now for this, we're going to need to mix various shades of yellow because as you can see, you've got the lighter part on the top. It's almost got sort of lines that divide where the sections of the banana are, go into a slightly darker colour, and then underneath it's a lot darker still. And by using these changes in colour, we'll be able to get, as we did with the apple, we'll be able to get the light side and the shade side, but also some texture into the shape of it to make a realistic painting. We've also got these lovely sort of brownish marks on the banana, which will again enhance it and help us paint something that looks 3D and realistic. Before we start painting the banana, I just want to show you how to mix these various shades of yellow, because the lemon yellow we have on our palette is not really quite a banana colour, but we're going to need a series of yellows of different shades. If we take the pure yellow to start with, and initially I'm going to put a little bit of white in that end, which will give me a very, very pale highlight colour. That's my first colour. Now, we haven't yet talked much about complementary colours. Adding a bit more yellow, bringing this across. The complementary colour on the colour wheel is the colour which is opposite each other. And in the case of yellow, it is violet. What a complementary colour will do, it will darken and dull down and sort of neutralise the first colour. So if we take some violet on our little palette knife here, and then put a tiny bit, and I'm talking about a very tiny bit, not very much, into the yellow, can you see it goes slightly duller, almost slightly mustard colour, and that gives us a very different yellow to the lemon and the white colour. So we've got a much more, I would call, sort of mid-banana tone colour, really. If we go stronger still, and let's mix some yellow into that larger amount of mauve, it will go to an almost brown colour. Can you see that that's dulling down? It's not going purple, it's going sort of a sort of brownish mud colour, or very dark shadow of banana colour. So now we've got our highlights, our lemon, which is, we will blend the lemon into this slightly altered with violet colour, and then I've got my shadow colour. For the colours on the actual the markings, the brown markings, well, you would say, well, maybe they're brown, but if you look at burnt sienna on its own, it's a bit too powerful. So in this case, I'm going to add a little bit of violet to it, just to keep it in, so so the violet is in every colour. If you have a colour that's in every colour, it sort of anchors it through. And also add a little bit of white there on the edge. So I've got sort of some pale brown and some, should put a bit more violet in there. I've got a sort of pinky colour and a brownish violetty colour. Those softer colours, which I hope are going to work well for any markings we put on the banana. Having mixed these colours, we're now ready to do our second study. So take your time, put these colours out on your palette and pre-mix them first with either the painting knife, which is, I have to say, I prefer to use for mixing. I use it for everything, or the flat palette knife. And just get a few little pools of colour. Make sure you mix enough, because if you don't mix enough colour, then you're going to have to go back and mix it again halfway through the painting. So once again, going to start with a drawing. So once again, I'll start with a drawing. I've got my little 2B pencil. 2B is quite nice. Anything towards B or HB is a little bit too hard and gives a very, the harder the line, it's paler, but it's also more difficult sometimes to rub out or paint over. So all I want to do to start with is get an approximate, I'm looking around the top of the banana, so it sort of curves around there, the top line coming down towards where the bottom of it is. It comes down here to almost a point and then comes out for a little bit of where the stem was, a little bit of shape on there. So I've got that shape approximately. You might find it easier to follow the sort of contours of the banana rather than trying to get the outline straight away. So I'm going to, there's a sort of shadow line there. Then there's another shadow line coming in, a bit fatter around there. And then right at the bottom, there's my very thin area, which is sort of darkish shadow, about there. Bring that down to a bit more of a point. That looks okay. That will do. Make that a little bit fatter, because we're just drawing an outline here. And again, I'm going to place a little pencil line on there. It just helps me sort of visualize where the flat is. On this banana, we're going to add a background as well as just painting the fruit. So that will give me the two colors of the background, where the going up behind and then on the flatter surface. So take your time and draw your outline, and then we're ready to paint. The fruit, I will continue using my favorite number 4 Filbert brush. These brushes do come in a set with this video. If you choose the sort of premium package of the video, then you will receive the set of brushes alongside the video package, and of course the link which gives you half an hour's private lesson with me afterwards, or at any stage during the recording. So we'll start with the brightest yellow, and this may look a little bit, oh no. So continuing our theme of painting from thin darks to thick highlights. I'm going to start with the shadow colour at the very bottom, and you're going to need a fair amount of paint on your brush. If it's not flowing enough, add a little more of the white spirit or Sansador or whatever thinner you've decided to use with your oils. I'm just going to put that in as a fairly straight fluid line, and there's a little bit of dark on there. We'll stick that in at the same time. Then move up to your middle yellow, which is yellow with a little bit of violet in it to make it sort of more of a dark banana colour. And again, see, if you press, as you press on the brush, and especially if you use the brush flat, the brush will sort of widen out and almost, it's going a little bit dry brush. That's because I'm being a little bit mean with my paint. I haven't got enough paint on the brush and I haven't quite thinned it enough. So let's go again. We'll bring this through and try and bring a shape all the way through in almost in one stroke. And you can see it starts to feel more banana shaped. We now want more yellow, but I'm adding yellow to this dark mix rather than going for pure lemon yellow, because I feel that pure lemon yellow might just be a little bit too yellow. Bananas are not lemons, they're not lemon yellow. So we'll just push those brush strokes again up to the top. And you can see in those brush strokes, we've sort of created our banana shape. Not bad. I've left a little bit of a gap here. You can see bits where the paper's shining through. At this stage, I'm not at all worried about that. I'm going to take a little bit of the very, very pale colour, which is white lemon. That's lemon yellow with white, to just remind myself that on the top there's a bit of light. And don't worry if that paint becomes very thick and the brush strokes are visible. It doesn't matter. With oil paint, and if you think about the old masters, when they're trying to authenticate oil paints, everybody's talking about, oh, well, is it the brush stroke of the master? Well, this needs to be the brush stroke, you know, your master brush stroke. A little bit of yellow on there. And then take the darker shadow colour and just put a little tip on the end. So that really is stage one of the banana. We then need to put some details on it and add some shadow to it. But before we do that, I said we're going to put a background in on this one. So for the first time, I'm going to take the larger brush, which is my number 8 filbert. So that's quite a bit larger, and you can see how much larger it is compared to 4. It's pretty much double the size. So that I can do some bolder brush strokes to put the background in. Because this banana is yellow and complementary to yellow is the violet, I thought it would be rather nice if we took some of the violet colour with, now what you need to do here is you'll need to lighten it with a little bit of white to get a pale violet colour, because don't forget we're going to need to put a shadow on there, and if we do very dark violet, we'll probably find that it's too dark and then you haven't got anything darker to put on as a shadow colour. But I want you to try and enjoy painting really bold brush strokes. So here, just put an area around it. This is only a study on a piece of paper, but so I'm going to enjoy applying the paint and applying it in a variety of strokes, and not what I call sort of like a Dulux or a decorating, so not where you just keep going very, very smooth. You will get a very flat surface if you do that, but it can look a bit flat, a bit dull. You start to move the brush around, and I'm having to keep remixing my mauve with the violet and adding more white and adding less white, and you can see that you get a variety of marks, which this would be sort of called painterly. So it's not absolutely flat photographic, it's more like a painting. And personally, I think that's more interesting and more exciting as a surface than just having it flat. So I'm just painting the table. We're not going up to the top yet. And we'll put those brush strokes. And you see now we've got a problem. We've got gaps around the edge. The banana is sort of sitting with a lot of the white of the canvas of the paper. It's showing between it. That's fine for now. Just take some more of your mix. Load your brush. possibly a little bit of spirit to just make it flow a bit more. And then you're going to carefully paint up to the edge of the fruit and just pull the brush away. You just push the edge with your filbert brush and just bring it along there so that you've brought it in, but don't forget to make sure you've got some interesting marks. You don't just want a flat line all the way around it. Take your time going around this side. I will come in from the top because of the camera, but you can always turn the paper around if it's easier. Just bring that in. So so the banana is beginning to look as though it's actually sat on a surface. And you see here, you just keep putting those marks in. And the more you press on, you see it's picking up different amounts of colour. So you've got lights and darks. You've got quite a lot of pattern turning just in this background, which is making it more interesting. So we've put the first part of the background in, and we want to put a little bit at the top in as well. Now, at the top of the background, I'm going to keep the same colours because this is a straightforward exercise. We don't want it to be too complicated. Putting out some more white paint. And all I'm going to do for the top of the background to vary it is go much, much paler with the violet. So it becomes, I haven't even cleaned my brush here. You can see there's still some of the residual dirty violet on there. And I'm just going to scrub in a much paler. Now for this, we're going to scrub. Can you see how I'm going diagonal brush strokes? Gives a different effect. All the way across. Carefully down towards the edge. Take your time to sort of where the two colours meet. Just bring that along there. There's a lot of this. I would say this is at least 80% white. So there's a lot of white in this mix, but I want those brush strokes to go diagonally as much as possible. And if you find that when you're doing this, the paint is sort of disappearing off your brush, you think, well, I can't seem to get any colour onto the canvas, you're probably pressing too hard with the brush. The more you press, as I said earlier, the more the paint sort of creeps up the brush. You see, most of the paint on my brush is in the top half of it. If your paint is coming right down to what the beginning of the ferrule, then you've been pressing too hard and you push the paint down. And what's happening there is that you've got no paint on the end. The paint's all in the middle of the brush. So you're painting away like mad and nothing's happening. So just take a little bit care to press not too hard, even when you're, pushing the paint around. Finally, on this background, we want the feeling that the light is going to come onto the top of the banana. And if the light's going to come on the top of the banana, I'm going to take a little bit of white with a tiny amount of the yellow, the lemon yellow, on my brush. I've got a very pale, it looks white, but there's a tiny bit of yellow in it. I'm going to say, right, well, the light's coming from the top there, and my shadow's going to go out here. So I'm going to add a little bit of yellow. Can you see how very, very softly I'm putting that into the top of the background, the top of what could be a wall, it could be anything that's in the back, to just give it a feeling, even a bit more white in there. It can be a little bit thicker, keeping all the brush strokes on this diagonal to give it a very different feel to the sort of crisscrossy movement that we had on the table. And that hopefully gives us a little feeling of light in that top corner coming down. That's probably enough. But you can see the variety of light. It's gone yellow. It almost goes a salmony colour because the yellow into the violet. And then this is plain violet and white. And all of this base was just a darker version of more violet and less white and a different brush strokes. So we've created our first background. Clean the brush and put the number 8 brush to one side. And then pick up your lovely your third brush, the round number 4, because now what we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit more detail onto our banana. Quite a lot of little marks on this banana. So if you remember, we mixed up the violet with a bit of burnt sienna. And I don't know if we put a bit of white in it. I think we did put a little bit of white in it. So I've got a sort of warm brown colour. Taking these lines, there's a little bit, I'm just going to very carefully look now on the banana where these marks are. And there's not very many of them, but they are important. There's a few little flecks on there. If you do too much of this, you'll probably overdo it and it'll be too much detail. But I just want to put a few little marks on there, and then there's quite a smudge on the top here. So I'm going to just put a little bit of a, you'll find that as you're doing this, you're picking up the colour underneath, the wet yellow. So keep a little cloth in your hand, keep wiping your brush, going back to your palette colour, dipping your brush into fresh colour and putting it back on. There's almost a line along there, and there's actually almost a line in here. There's a few little marks in there. I don't know whether to put those in or not. That might be too, I think that might be too much. I want you to put some of the marks on the banana, but if you feel it's getting too messy, do less. In painting generally, less is better than more. So on here, that's getting a lot darker, so I'm going back into here and got that little bit of, but it is the burnt sienna, the brown colour, and a little bit of violet in it as well, but no white. And again on the end there, that's quite dark. I've lost the darkness on the sort of foot of the banana there. It's just, something's gone a bit wrong. Just take that. That's better. A few little marks on there. There is a line there. I don't know if we want to put that on. There we are. And it's beginning to feel quite like a bun. Don't have this line completely all the way along. Leave a gap. And in fact, I'm going back to the yellow with the touch of violet. Going back to my yellow in small brush and just putting that back in as yellow rather than as brown all the way along. So it just becomes a change in colours. That's the darker yellow area there and the lighter. And can you see how effective that is in creating your banana? It's easy, this oil painting, isn't it? And finally, on our picture, although we've got the light coming up, we're going to need a little bit of shadow. And in this case, we're only using two colours here. I'm just going to take some of the dark, which is the violet, with a little bit of the burnt sienna in it, and try and give it a slightly, I think mainly violet. So it's just a really dark shade. So just try and give it a little bit of shadow along there and along here, but it's not very deep. So let's just bring that along there to a bit of shadow up to the bottom of the banana with the colour. Going to need a little bit, going to need some more spirit on my brush to make it flow better. Because that needs to be flat, that area, because that's just flat shadow. And that should just give us, anchor the banana onto the table. But I think that could be a little bit wider. Looking at my painting from further back, I think that could be a little bit wider there. Just bring that out. If you turn the brush on its edge, you get a line. It's a bit, I don't really want that. That's it. Just soften that off a bit. That's better. As with all paintings, you're making judgments all the time. There's no sort of absolute perfectly right or wrong. You're just making your own judgments as to what looks right for you. And I think that looks like a very believable banana on a background. Let's just flick back and take a look at the original what's in front of me, the banana in front of me, and see what you think. I know it's on a blue cloth and we've used a mauve. I quite like that. And in fact, in many ways, I think that the actual painting of it is more exciting and more interesting. So have a go. Well, I hope you enjoyed part one. Join me in the next video to paint a complete still life painting, again using fruit as our inspiration.